didn't mean to look inside her purse. It was just sitting there on the kitchen chair, slumped open like it had given up holding its secrets, and I was only trying to move it so I could wipe the crumbs off the table. But when I lifted it, something heavy slid forward inside, thicker than a wallet, stiffer than a notebook, and a corner of cream-colored paper peeked out. I remember the way my stomach tightened before my mind even caught up. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and the faint tick-tick of the clock above the sink. I stood there longer than I should have, holding my breath, my fingers already curling around that paper like they had a will of their own. At the top, in bold letters, was the word deed, and underneath it, my address. That was the moment something old and familiar broke inside me. Not loudly, not all at once, just a slow, tired cracking, like a beam that's been holding too much weight for too long. But to understand why that piece of paper felt heavier than grief itself, you need to know how my sister came to live with me in the first place. Before all of this, my life was quiet. Not the lonely kind of quiet, but the settled kind. The kind you earn after raising kids, burying a husband, and learning how to sleep on only one side of the bed without reaching for someone who isn't there anymore. My husband, Walter, had been gone 3 years by then. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel. One year we were arguing over whether the porch railing needed repainting, and the next I was learning how to sign my own name on insurance forms while pretending my hands weren't shaking. The house, this house, had been ours for 32 years, a modest 2-story with pale blue siding and a maple tree out front that dropped its leaves like copper coins every October. Walter planted that tree when our youngest was born. He said he wanted something that would outlive us both. After he passed, the kids worried about me being alone. They called more often, visited when they could, but they had their own lives, their own mortgages and messes. I told them I was fine, and mostly I was telling the truth. My sister Lydia was the one who worried the loudest. She's 2 years younger than me, but you'd never guess it. Lydia has always moved through the world like she was owed something: attention, help, forgiveness. Growing up, she was the one who cried the hardest, slammed doors the loudest, needed the most. I was the steady one, the older sister, the one who smoothed things over when our mother sighed and said, "Please, just give her what she wants." We stayed close in adulthood, though close might not be the right word. We spoke often. Holidays, birthdays, long phone calls where she talked and I listened. Lydia had been married twice, divorced twice, and never quite landed on her feet. There was always a story: a boss who didn't appreciate her, a landlord who was unfair, a boyfriend who promised more than he delivered. So when she called me one evening, her voice thin and shaky, I didn't think twice. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she said. "The rent's gone up again. I can't keep moving, Martha. I'm so tired." I was standing at the sink, washing a single plate and cup, dinner for one. I watched the water bead and slide off the porcelain, listened to her breathe on the other end of the line. "You can stay here for a while," I said almost automatically, "just until you get back on your feet." She cried then, soft at first, then harder, told me I was a blessing, told me Walter would be proud of me. That should have been my first warning, using my dead husband's name like a seal of approval, but grief has a way of dulling instincts. I wanted to feel useful, needed, like the house still had a purpose beyond holding my memories. Lydia arrived with 3 suitcases, a box of old photo albums, and a promise. She said, "I'll help you, Martha. Cooking, cleaning, bills, everything. You shouldn't be alone with all this." At first, it felt almost nice. The house had sounds again: footsteps, a radio playing low in the mornings, someone else fussing over whether the coffee was too weak. We fell into a rhythm that felt familiar in a way that tugged at my childhood. 2 sisters under one roof again, sharing space and stories. She took over the grocery shopping, then the utility bills. "You've been through enough," she'd say, waving me off when I asked questions. "Let me handle it." I didn't argue. That was my second mistake. The first few months passed without incident. Lydia cooked big meals, insisted we eat together at the table. She asked about Walter sometimes in that careful way people do when they're not sure how much you want to remember. I told her stories about the way he whistled off key, about how he always burned the first pancake on purpose because he said it was bad luck to start with a perfect one. But slowly, the tone shifted. She began making small comments about how expensive the upkeep must be, about how lucky I was to have a house all paid off, about how hard it was for people like her, without stability, without help. "You've always been good with money," she said once, folding laundry that wasn't hers. "I never had your discipline." There was something in her voice then, not exactly admiration, not exactly resentment either, something quieter, calculating. I noticed she asked more questions about the house, when we refinanced, whose name was on what, where I kept important papers. I brushed it off. She was my sister, blood. We shared a childhood bedroom, a mother's temper, a history no one else could fully understand. I told myself I was being paranoid. And then came the afternoon with the purse, the crumbs, the paper. The moment when trust finally tipped over into something darker. I stood in the kitchen, the deed trembling slightly in my hands, and for the first time since Walter died, I felt truly, dangerously alone. I slid the deed back into Lydia's purse like it had burned me. My hands were shaking, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but a small, stubborn tremor that made my fingers feel unreliable. I told myself I was overreacting, that there had to be an explanation. Maybe she was helping me organize paperwork. Maybe she'd taken it out to photocopy it for insurance. Lydia did things her own way, always had. Still, I didn't sit down right away. I leaned against the counter and waited for my heart to slow, counted my breaths the way the grief counselor once taught me. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The clock kept ticking. The refrigerator hummed on, indifferent. When Lydia came back from the bedroom, she was humming softly, a tune I didn't recognize. She glanced at me, smiled, and reached for her purse. "You okay?" she asked. "You look pale." "I'm fine," I said, too quickly. I hated how thin my voice sounded. She slung the purse over her shoulder and went outside to take a call. I watched her through the window, her back turned to me, her shoulders relaxed in a way that didn't match the storm inside my chest. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my bed listening to the house settle, every creak sounding like a question I didn't want to answer. My mind kept replaying the image of that document, my address printed so plainly, like it belonged to anyone who held the paper. I thought of Walter, of the nights we stayed up late talking about retirement, about how this house was supposed to be my safety net, my anchor. By morning, I had decided not to say anything. Not yet. I needed to be sure. The days that followed felt different, even though nothing obvious changed. Lydia still cooked, still paid the bills, still asked me if I wanted tea in the afternoons. But now I was watching, really watching, for the first time. I noticed how she answered the phone in the hallway instead of the living room, how she lowered her voice when talking about documents and appointments, how she'd started insisting on driving me to places I'd gone alone for years. "It's safer," she said. "You're not as steady as you used to be." That one stung. I was 68, not helpless. But I let it go. Letting things go had always been my strength and my weakness. One afternoon, while Lydia was out grocery shopping, I did something I'd never done before. I went into her room. It smelled faintly of lavender and something sweeter, like new plastic. Her suitcases were tucked neatly in the closet now, the box of photo albums stacked by the wall. I told myself I was only looking for a pen, that I'd be in and out in seconds. But my feet carried me to her nightstand. The top drawer was unlocked. Inside were receipts, loose change, a small notebook. I flipped it open and saw my name written across the top of a page in Lydia's looping handwriting. Underneath it, a list: utilities, property tax, insurance, mortgage, paid. My stomach dropped. There were notes in the margins, dates, dollar amounts, and then a line that made my mouth go dry. Transfer timeline. I closed the notebook as if it might shout at me. My hands were cold now, my skin prickling like I'd stepped into a draft. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't help. This was planning. When Lydia came home, arms full of grocery bags, I forced myself to act normal. I helped her put things away, commented on the price of eggs, asked about the weather like none of this was unraveling me from the inside. That night, over dinner, she mentioned something new. "I've been thinking," she said casually, spearing a piece of chicken, "it might be smart to simplify things, legally." I looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "Estate planning, just in case. These things get messy if you wait too long." I swallowed. "I already have a will." "Yes, but it's old," she replied smoothly. "Things change. People change." I thought of the notebook, the list, the word transfer. "I'm not ready for that," I said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course not. I'm just looking out for you." That phrase, "looking out for you," started appearing everywhere. When she suggested I stop managing my own bank account, when she offered to hold on to my checkbook so it doesn't get lost, when she insisted on sitting in during a call with my insurance agent. Each time, a little more of my independence slipped away, and I let it. Because part of me was tired of being the strong one, tired of making decisions alone. Lydia filled a space I hadn't realized was empty, not just in the house, but in my sense of being needed. One evening, my daughter called. "Mom," she said, hesitating, "is Aunt Lydia living with you permanently?" "No," I said, "just until she gets settled." There was a pause. "She called me last week." My heart skipped. "About what?" "She asked about the house, said she was helping you manage things now." I closed my eyes. That's not true. Or maybe I was saying it to myself. After we hung up, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the framed photo of Walter on the mantel. He was smiling in it, squinting slightly in the sun, one arm around my shoulders. "I should have been paying attention," I whispered to him. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Lydia, not yet. I wasn't going to accuse her or cry or beg. I needed facts, proof, something solid enough to stand on when everything else felt like it was slipping away. So I called a lawyer, not to make changes, just to ask questions. And what I learned during that quiet, careful conversation would change the way I saw my sister forever. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish. It was the kind of place that made you speak more softly without realizing it, as if the walls themselves were listening. I sat across from a man named Robert Klein, his gray hair neatly parted, his glasses perched low on his nose as he skimmed the notes I'd written down on a yellow legal pad. "I just want to understand my options," I told him, "before I say anything to anyone." He nodded. "That's wise." I explained the situation carefully, that my sister had moved in, that she was helping with bills, that I'd found a copy of my house deed in her possession along with notes that suggested intentions. I left out the notebook for now, unsure how much I wanted to reveal. "Has she had you sign anything?" he asked. "No," I said quickly. "At least, I don't think so." He leaned back in his chair. That's an important distinction. He explained how property transfers worked, how deeds didn't move themselves, how no one could legally take my house without my signature unless there was fraud, coercion, or a power of attorney involved. My chest tightened. Power of attorney? He studied me for a moment. "Do you recall signing one?" I shook my head, but a flicker of doubt passed through me. Lydia had asked me to sign things before: insurance updates, utility authorizations, just routine paperwork, she'd said, sliding forms across the table while dinner cooled. Robert must have seen something on my face. "We can check," he said, "public records, and I recommend you gather every document you signed in the past year." I left the office with a folder under my arm and a weight in my chest that felt heavier than fear. It felt like grief all over again, only this time the person I was mourning was the sister I thought I had. That evening, Lydia was unusually cheerful. "I made your favorite," she said, setting a plate of meatloaf in front of me. "You haven't eaten much lately." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. That was the worst part. Even now, even knowing something was wrong, pieces of the old Lydia were still there. Or maybe I was just clinging to them. As we ate, she talked about a friend who'd lost her home due to bad planning. "It's sad," she said, shaking her head. "All that stress could have been avoided if someone had stepped in sooner." I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you finally stop hoping things will turn out differently. The next day, while Lydia was out, I went through my file cabinet. It was tucked in the hallway closet, the same place it had always been. I'd kept things organized over the years: tax returns, medical records, the deed itself, still in its original envelope. Or at least, it had been. The envelope was gone. I stood there staring at the empty space, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear it. I checked again, then again, moving papers, opening folders, telling myself I must have misplaced it. I hadn't. That night I confronted her, not with yelling, not with accusations, just a question spoken as calmly as I could manage. "Lydia," I said, as she poured herself a glass of wine, "have you seen the original deed to the house?" She didn't look at me right away. That pause, barely a second, told me everything. "I needed it for something," she said lightly. "It's safe." "For what?" I asked. She sighed, like I was being difficult. "Martha, you worry too much. I'm just trying to help you get things in order." "Did I sign anything?" My voice was steady, but my hands were clenched in my lap. "Anything that gives you control over the house?" She laughed then, a short, dismissive sound. "Of course not. Why would you think that?" I watched her closely, the way she avoided my eyes, the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. I spoke to a lawyer. Her color drained from her face. "You did what?" she snapped. "Just asked questions, like whether someone can transfer property without the owner's consent." She set the glass down hard. "You don't trust me." It wasn't a question. "I found a copy of the deed in your purse and a notebook with my name on it." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Finally, she spoke. "You're imagining things." "No," I said. "I'm seeing them clearly for the first time." Her mask slipped then. The softness fell away, replaced by something sharp and resentful. "Do you know how long I've struggled while you had everything handed to you? A stable marriage, a house, security?" "I earned this," I said. "Walter and I built it together. And now you're alone, with more than you need." That hurt more than I expected. She went on, her words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for years, about how unfair life was, about how I'd always been the responsible one, the favored one, about how she deserved something for once. "I wasn't stealing," she said. "I was protecting us, planning for the future. My future, without my consent." She stood abruptly. "You're overreacting." But I saw fear in her eyes now. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time since Walter died. The next morning, I called Robert again. My voice shook as I told him about the missing deed. "That changes things," he said. "I want you to come in with whatever paperwork you can find. And Martha, don't sign anything, not a single thing." I hung up and stared at the phone. The betrayal was real now, solid, and I knew with a clarity that surprised me that whatever happened next would change our family forever. The days after that confrontation moved slowly, like time itself had thickened. Lydia and I shared the same space, but not the same air. She avoided me, stayed in her room longer, left the house at odd hours. When we did cross paths, her politeness felt brittle, stretched thin over something sharp and waiting. I did exactly what Robert told me. I gathered every document I could find, bank statements, insurance letters, tax records, and took them to his office in a manila envelope that felt too light for the trouble it carried. He spread everything across his desk, methodical and quiet. "There's something else," I said, my throat tight. "She may have had me sign things I didn't fully understand." He nodded. "Let's go through them." That's when we found it. Buried among routine-looking forms was a limited power of attorney. My signature sat at the bottom, familiar and damning. It was dated 6 months earlier. I remembered the day vaguely. Lydia had brought the papers to me after dinner, the television murmuring in the background. She said it was for insurance coordination in case of emergencies. I hadn't read the fine print. I trusted her. "She can't transfer property with this alone," Robert said carefully, "but she can access records, obtain copies, prepare paperwork." My chest tightened. So she was getting ready. "Yes," he said, "but she hasn't crossed the final line yet." "Not yet." He advised me to revoke the power of attorney immediately, to secure my accounts, to change locks if necessary. Each word felt like another nail sealing something shut. That evening, when I got home, Lydia was waiting in the living room. "You went behind my back," she said. "No greeting, no pretense." "I protected myself," I replied. She stood up, pacing. "You're letting outsiders poison you against your own sister. You took my deed. You took control without asking." "I was trying to save you from yourself," she shouted. The sound echoed, sharp and unfamiliar in the house. "You're aging. You're vulnerable. Someone had to step in." "I didn't ask you to." Her voice broke then, but not in a way that softened her. "You never ask for help. You just expect people to offer it, and then you act shocked when they want something in return." That night, I slept with my purse under my pillow, my phone fully charged, the bedroom door locked tight. I hated what we'd become, 2 women bound by blood and suspicion, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. 2 days later, Robert called me with an urgency I'd never heard in his voice. "She's filed preliminary paperwork," he said. "Not a transfer, but a notice of intent. We need to act quickly." My legs went weak. "What do I do?" "You confront her," he said, "and you do it with witnesses." So I called my children. They came that weekend, my daughter, my son, and his wife, faces drawn with worry and disbelief. Lydia sat rigid on the couch as I laid everything out: the purse, the notebook, the power of attorney, the missing deed. At first, she denied it. Then she minimized it. Then when the evidence stacked too high to ignore, she exploded. "I gave up my life to take care of her. I deserved security too." The room was silent except for her sobs. My daughter stood. "Aunt Lydia," she said gently, "help doesn't come with strings attached." That was the moment Lydia realized she'd lost control. Within a week, the power of attorney was revoked, my accounts secured, the deed reissued and placed in a safe deposit box only I could access. With my children's support and a police report that made my hands shake as I signed it, I gave Lydia 30 days to move out. She didn't speak to me when she packed. On the last day, she stood in the doorway with her suitcases, the same ones she'd arrived with. "You'll regret this," she said. "Maybe," I replied, "but it's my regret to carry." The door closed behind her with a final, echoing click. The house felt hollow at first, too quiet, but slowly, as days turned into weeks, the silence softened. it became peaceful again. I started reclaiming small things, cooking meals I liked, opening windows, sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the maple tree sway in the breeze. One afternoon, I found Walter's old toolbox in the garage. I ran my fingers over the worn wood and smiled. "This house is still mine," I whispered, and for the first time in months, I believed it.
The fallout didn't end when Lydia left the house. If anything, that was when it truly began. Families have a way of absorbing conflict and then releasing it in quiet, uncomfortable waves. Phone calls slowed, group chats went silent. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions. Some were careful, asking how I was holding up. Others were sharper, their words wrapped in concern but edged with judgment. "She only wanted to help," one aunt said on the phone. "You know how Lydia is," a cousin added. "She means well." I learned very quickly how lonely the truth can be when it doesn't fit the story people prefer. Lydia didn't disappear. She stayed with a friend across town and began telling her version of events. In her telling, I was confused, paranoid, manipulated by my children and a greedy lawyer. She said I'd turned on her after she sacrificed everything to care for me. At first, hearing this hurt more than I expected. I'd spent my whole life being the reasonable one, the steady one. I wasn't used to being painted as cruel. But then something happened that shifted everything. I received a letter from the county clerk. My hands trembled as I opened it at the kitchen table, sunlight pooling across the wood like nothing was wrong. Inside was a notice, formal, impersonal, informing me that an inquiry had been opened regarding attempted misrepresentation in a property filing. I called Robert immediately. "She tried to move forward anyway," she said grimly, "after the revocation." That single choice, her refusal to stop, changed the tone of everything. The investigation was quiet, procedural, but serious. Lydia was called in to explain herself. She brought an attorney, so did I. Sitting across from her in that small municipal office felt stranger than any courtroom drama I'd ever imagined. She wouldn't look at me. When they asked her why she had pursued control over a property she didn't own, she said it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error. When they presented the notebook, yes, the one I'd copied and turned over, her explanation faltered. I didn't speak much during that meeting. I didn't need to. The facts spoke clearly enough on their own. Word spread slowly after that, the same way gossip always does, half-whispered, distorted, but impossible to contain. Some family members apologized. Others stayed quiet, unsure which side to land on. What surprised me most was Lydia's silence afterward. No calls, no messages, no dramatic apologies or angry accusations, just absence. For a while, that absence felt like grief. I'd lost my sister, not to death, but to something more complicated, a truth I couldn't unsee. But gradually, the house began to feel like mine again in ways it hadn't since Walter died. I rearranged the living room furniture, something Lydia never liked, hung my own photos back on the walls. I even repainted the guest room, soft green, the color Walter once said reminded him of early spring. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I found a stack of letters Walter had written me during a business trip years ago. I sat on the floor reading them, dust in my hair, tears slipping down my face, not from sadness, but from gratitude. He had trusted me, built this life with me, left it in my care. I realized then that part of my healing wasn't just about removing Lydia from my home. It was about reclaiming my voice. I started saying no more often, to favors I didn't want to give, to conversations that drained me, to guilt disguised as obligation.
Months later, I saw Lydia once more, unexpectedly, at the grocery store. She looked smaller somehow, tired. Our eyes met briefly in the produce aisle, the space between us filled with everything we hadn't said. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I nodded once, polite, distant, and that was all. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no shouted forgiveness, just a quiet understanding that some lines, once crossed, don't lead back to where you started. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I poured myself a cup of tea and listened to the familiar sounds of the house, the clock, the pipes, the steady hum of a life continuing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. Healing didn't come like an apology or a sudden sense of peace. It came quietly, the way dawn does, soft enough that you don't notice it until the light is already there. For a long time after Lydia left, I kept expecting the house to feel empty. I thought the silence would echo, remind me of what I'd lost. Instead, the quiet began to feel honest. There were no half-finished conversations hanging in the air, no tension tucked into corners, just space and time. The first real sign that I was changing came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke up before the alarm, sunlight slipping through the curtains, and realized I hadn't dreamed about Lydia at all. No arguments, no explanations, no rehearsed speeches I'd never get to say. My mind had finally stopped circling the same wound. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once held her purse and felt my world tilt. The wood was warm under my palms, solid, real. I thought about how close I'd come to losing this place, not just the structure, but what it represented. Independence, safety, the last thing Walter and I built together. Grief has a way of softening your edges. It makes you want to lean, to rest, to believe someone else will carry the weight for a while. I didn't blame myself for that anymore. I understood it. What I did blame myself for, what I promised myself I'd never do again, was mistaking silence for peace. Over the months that followed, I began rebuilding in small, deliberate ways. I met with a financial advisor on my own. I updated my will with clear instructions and no room for interpretation. I labeled folders, wrote notes to myself, asked questions until I understood the answers. It felt strange at first, advocating so firmly for myself, but with each step, something inside me straightened. My children noticed it too. "You sound lighter," my daughter said once on the phone, "like you're not carrying something anymore." She was right. I wasn't. I started inviting friends over again, women I'd known for years but drifted from while I was grieving and then distracted. We sat in the living room with cups of tea, talked about books and aches and the small absurdities of life. I laughed more than I expected to. One afternoon, while we were clearing plates, a friend touched my arm gently and said, "I don't know how you handled all that with such dignity." I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I hadn't always felt dignified. I'd felt scared, confused, ashamed of how close I'd come to being fooled. But dignity, I was learning, isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up without letting bitterness take the lead. A full year passed before I saw Lydia again. It was at a family funeral, an elderly cousin we'd both loved in different ways. I almost didn't go, afraid of reopening something fragile inside me. But then I realized that fear no longer got to make my decisions. She stood near the back of the room, thinner than I remembered, her hair pulled back more tightly than usual. When our eyes met, there was no anger in hers, just something like regret and something like acceptance. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Sometimes closure doesn't arrive as a conversation. Sometimes it arrives as understanding, quiet, mutual, and final. Later that evening, back home, I walked through the house, room by room. I touched the banister Walter had polished every spring. I stood in the doorway of the guest room I'd repainted. I paused at the front window, watching the streetlights flicker on beneath the maple tree. I thought about the woman I'd been when Lydia first arrived. Tired, grieving, eager to believe help wouldn't cost me anything. And I thought about the woman standing here now. She was still kind, still generous, but she was no longer unguarded. There's a difference. I wish I could say this story ends with reconciliation, that my sister and I found our way back to each other, wiser and gentler than before. But real life doesn't always tie things up that neatly. What I can say is this: I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, that love without boundaries isn't love, it's risk disguised as loyalty, and that your home, your peace, your future are not things you owe to anyone simply because they share your blood. If someone comes into your life offering help, look closely, not with suspicion, but with clarity. Ask questions, keep your voice, trust your instincts when something feels off, even if the person involved is someone you've loved your whole life. Because sometimes the hardest lesson isn't learning how to forgive, it's learning when to say no. This house still stands. The walls still hold my memories, and when I lock the door at night, I don't do it out of fear anymore. I do it out of care for myself. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have trusted longer or acted sooner? Tell me in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a moment when you had to choose yourself, I hope you'll stay a while. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and know you're not alone in learning these lessons, no matter how late in life they arrive. After everything settled, after the paperwork was filed and the phone calls slowed and the house finally felt like mine again, there was a strange stretch of time where nothing happened. No drama, no emergencies, no one knocking at the door asking for explanations. At first, that emptiness scared me more than the chaos ever had. I'd grown so used to reacting, to grief, to Lydia's moods, to other people's needs, that being still felt unnatural. I caught myself inventing worries just to fill the space. I'd double-check locks that were already secure, reread bank statements I already understood, sit with my tea going cold, listening too closely to the clock. Healing, I learned, isn't always comforting. Sometimes it's unsettling because it asks you to sit with yourself after the noise is gone. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer in the kitchen, I found an old envelope addressed in Walter's handwriting. Inside was a note he'd written years before, after we'd argued about money, one of those quiet arguments that never fully resolves but fades with time. "This house is our promise to each other," he'd written. "No matter what happens, it's meant to keep you safe." I sat down right there on the floor and cried. Not the sharp, gasping kind, the slow kind that comes when something heavy finally loosens its grip. Walter had trusted me to protect this life we built. And for a moment, just a moment, I'd almost handed it over out of exhaustion and misplaced loyalty. That realization didn't shame me anymore. It strengthened me, because I had stopped it. As the months went on, I started volunteering at the local library 2 mornings a week. Nothing grand, just shelving books, helping children find stories they loved. But it gave my days shape, purpose that didn't involve sacrificing myself for someone else. One woman there, around my age, shared coffee with me during breaks. One day she mentioned how her nephew had moved in temporarily and was now pressuring her to co-sign loans. I listened quietly, my hands wrapped around my mug. "You don't have to answer right now," I told her, "and you don't have to feel guilty for protecting yourself." She looked at me like no one had ever said that to her before. That was when I realized this story, my story, was bigger than me. So many women are raised to be the safe place, the soft landing, the one who keeps the peace. We learn early that love means accommodating, forgiving, enduring, and those are beautiful qualities until someone mistakes them for permission. I don't hate my sister. That surprises people when I say it, but it's the truth. Hate would keep me tied to her in a way I no longer am. What I feel instead is clarity. I see now that Lydia wasn't just greedy, she was afraid. Afraid of aging without stability, afraid of being left behind while others seemed to manage life better than she did. Fear can twist people into versions of themselves they barely recognize. Understanding that doesn't excuse what she did, but it allows me to let go without bitterness. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on the porch and watch the lights come on in the neighborhood. I think about how many stories are unfolding behind those doors, how many quiet compromises, how many unspoken worries, how many people giving more than they should because it feels easier than saying no. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to protect what you worked for. You are allowed to ask questions, even of people you love. You are allowed to pause before agreeing without explaining yourself. Trust should feel steady, not slippery. Help should feel supportive, not controlling. And love should never require you to disappear. I used to think strength meant enduring quietly, smiling through discomfort, letting things slide for the sake of family. Now I know better. Strength is speaking when your voice shakes. Strength is choosing discomfort now over regret later. Strength is closing a door, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. This house still holds laughter and loss, arguments and forgiveness, past and future all under one roof. But now it also holds something new: boundaries and peace. If you're facing a situation where someone you trust is asking for more and more control, more access, more sacrifice, I hope my story gives you permission to slow down and look closely. Ask yourself, does this feel like help or like pressure? Does this make me feel safer or smaller? And if you're already past that moment, if you're picking up the pieces after a betrayal that came from someone close, know this: you didn't fail, you learned. And learning, even when it hurts, is a kind of freedom. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If it resonated with you, if it reminded you of a choice you're facing or one you've already made, share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about truth, boundaries, and finding your way back to yourself, stay with me. Subscribe, support the channel, and take care of your peace, because no one will guard it for you the way you can. There's something no one tells you about choosing yourself later in life. People expect you to be done, settled, finished becoming. But after everything with Lydia, I realized I was still unfolding, just more carefully now, like paper you smooth out instead of tearing open. The first real test of that came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday morning when my phone rang, the kind of early call that tightens your chest before you even answer. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring once, twice, then picked up. "Martha?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes." "My name is Elaine. I'm a friend of your sister's." I closed my eyes. "She gave me your number," Elaine continued. "I hope that's all right. She's having a hard time." There it was, the familiar pull, the old instinct to rush in, to fix, to carry what wasn't mine. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. Elaine hesitated. "She's struggling financially. She mentioned the house, said there might be a way to work something out." I felt my shoulders tense, then slowly relax. "No," I said, not sharply, not angrily, just clearly. "There isn't." There was silence on the other end. "I understand," Elaine said finally. "I just thought I should ask." After I hung up, I sat very still. My heart was racing, but underneath it was something steadier than fear: resolve. Old me would have explained, apologized, questioned myself for days afterward. New me poured another cup of coffee and went about my morning. That was when I knew the change was real. Not long after that, I met with a small group at the community center, women my age, some older, some younger, who gathered weekly to talk about life transitions: divorce, widowhood, retirement, estrangement, the things no one prepares you for. One afternoon, after listening to a woman describe how her adult son had taken over her finances for her own good, I shared my story. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't paint myself as a hero. I just told the truth. The room was quiet when I finished. Then one woman reached for my hand. Another nodded, tears in her eyes. Someone whispered, "I thought I was the only one." That's when I understood something important. Betrayal doesn't always come wearing the face of a villain. Sometimes it comes smiling, offering help, asking for trust. And that makes it harder to talk about. But silence is where it thrives. Over time, the house began to feel less like a monument to the past and more like a place of presence. I hosted Sunday dinners again, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I planted herbs in the backyard and let the garden get a little wild. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't living with their consequences. One evening, as I was sorting mail, I came across an old photograph tucked inside a book. Lydia and I as girls, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. For a moment, my chest ached. I didn't tear the photo up. I didn't hide it away either. I placed it back in the book and slid it onto the shelf. Some memories don't need to be erased to lose their power. I won't pretend there aren't days when I miss my sister, or rather, the idea of her, the version I thought I knew. Grief isn't linear. It circles back, soft but persistent. But I've learned that missing someone doesn't mean inviting them back into places they no longer respect. That lesson has carried into every part of my life. I listen more closely to how I feel around people. I pay attention to whether generosity flows both ways. I trust discomfort as information, not something to push through. And most importantly, I no longer confuse guilt with love. The house still creaks at night, the maple tree still sheds its leaves, time still moves forward whether we're ready or not. But now, when I walk through my front door, I feel something I didn't realize I'd lost for a while: ownership. Not just of the property, but of my choices. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it's too late to redraw lines, to reclaim what's yours, to disappoint someone in order to protect yourself, let me tell you this as plainly as I can. It isn't. You don't age out of self-respect. You don't forfeit your right to safety because you're kind. And you don't owe access to anyone who uses love as leverage. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, "This is where it stops." I said it, and my life grew quieter, but also stronger. And if that quiet feels unfamiliar at first, stay with it. It might just be peace learning how to live with you. One woman there, around my age, shared coffee with me during breaks. One day she mentioned how her nephew had moved in temporarily and was now pressuring her to co-sign loans. I listened quietly, my hands wrapped around my mug. "You don't have to answer right now," I told her, "and you don't have to feel guilty for protecting yourself." She looked at me like no one had ever said that to her before. That was when I realized this story, my story, was bigger than me. So many women are raised to be the safe place, the soft landing, the one who keeps the peace. We learn early that love means accommodating, forgiving, enduring. And those are beautiful qualities until someone mistakes them for permission. I don't hate my sister. That surprises people when I say it, but it's the truth. Hate would keep me tied to her in a way I no longer am. What I feel instead is clarity. I see now that Lydia wasn't just greedy, she was afraid. Afraid of aging without stability, afraid of being left behind while others seemed to manage life better than she did. Fear can twist people into versions of themselves they barely recognize. Understanding that doesn't excuse what she did, but it allows me to let go without bitterness. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on the porch and watch the lights come on in the neighborhood. I think about how many stories are unfolding behind those doors, how many quiet compromises, how many unspoken worries, how many people giving more than they should because it feels easier than saying no. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to protect what you worked for. You are allowed to ask questions, even of people you love. You are allowed to pause before agreeing without explaining yourself. Trust should feel steady, not slippery. Help should feel supportive, not controlling. And love should never require you to disappear. I used to think strength meant enduring quietly, smiling through discomfort, letting things slide for the sake of family. Now I know better. Strength is speaking when your voice shakes. Strength is choosing discomfort now over regret later. Strength is closing a door not out of anger, but out of self-respect. This house still holds laughter and loss, arguments and forgiveness, past and future all under one roof. But now it also holds something new, boundaries and peace. If you're facing a situation where someone you trust is asking for more and more control, more access, more sacrifice, I hope my story gives you permission to slow down and look closely. Ask yourself, does this feel like help or like pressure? Does this make me feel safer or smaller? And if you're already past that moment, if you're picking up the pieces after a betrayal that came from someone close, know this: you didn't fail, you learned, and learning, even when it hurts, is a kind of freedom. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If it resonated with you, if it reminded you of a choice you're facing or one you've already made, share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about truth, boundaries, and finding your way back to yourself, stay with me. Subscribe, support the channel, and take care of your peace, because no one will guard it for you the way you can. Time has a way of testing the lessons we think we've already learned. Just when you believe you've settled into your new understanding, your new boundaries, life leans in gently and asks, "Are you sure?" For me, that question arrived in the form of a phone call on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. It was my daughter. "Mom," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and you can say no." That alone told me how much had changed. She'd always been considerate, but this was different. This was respect, offered instead of assumed. "What is it?" I asked. Her voice softened. "Aunt Lydia reached out. She wants to know if you'd consider meeting her, just to talk." I closed my eyes and listened to the rain tapping against the windows. For a moment, I was back in that kitchen, holding the deed, my hands trembling. For another moment, I was a child again, sharing a bedroom with my sister, whispering secrets in the dark. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That's okay," my daughter replied. "I just wanted to ask. There's no pressure." After we hung up, I sat with the question longer than I expected. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to be sure my answer came from clarity, not fear. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. People think it's about reopening doors, restoring access, pretending nothing happened. But real forgiveness, the kind that heals instead of harms, doesn't demand reunion. It demands honesty. I thought about what meeting Lydia would give me and what it might take away. I thought about the peace I'd built carefully, brick by brick, since she left. I thought about how far I'd come from the woman who signed papers she didn't read because she trusted too easily. That evening, I wrote Lydia a letter. Not an emotional one, not a confrontational one, just the truth. I told her I wished her well, that I hoped she found stability and peace, that I believed people could change, but that trust, once broken in such a fundamental way, didn't reset itself with time alone. I forgive you, I wrote, but I don't feel safe reopening a relationship that once cost me so much. I sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning, and that was that. No dramatic response followed, no angry messages, just quiet acceptance as far as I could tell. And for the first time, I understood that closure doesn't always look like mutual agreement. Sometimes it looks like standing firm without hostility. Life continued, seasons passed, birthdays came and went. I turned 70 surrounded by my children, laughter filling the same rooms that once held so much tension. We ate cake at the kitchen table. Someone spilled coffee, someone else laughed too hard at a silly story. At one point, my son raised his glass and said, "To Mom for teaching us what strength actually looks like." I smiled, embarrassed, but deeply moved, because strength, I've learned, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't always feel bold or brave in the moment. Often it feels like discomfort, like choosing the harder path because the easier one asks you to shrink. Late one night, unable to sleep, I walked through the house again, something I still do from time to time. I paused at the front door and rested my hand against the wood. This door had welcomed joy. It had absorbed anger. It had closed on betrayal, and it had stayed standing. So had I. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I tell it because there are so many people, especially women, who quietly give away pieces of themselves in the name of family, peace, or love, who ignore that small voice saying something isn't right because they don't want to seem unkind. If that's you, I want you to know something. Listening to your instincts doesn't make you cold. Protecting your future doesn't make you selfish, and saying no doesn't mean you failed at loving someone. It means you chose to love yourself, too. This house is still here, the maple tree still grows, the rooms still hold echoes of a life fully lived, mistakes and all. And when I sit in the quiet now, I don't feel emptiness, I feel earned peace. If you're standing at the edge of a decision, one that asks you to choose between comfort and truth, I hope my story reminds you that it's okay to choose truth, even when it's painful, even when it changes everything, because sometimes the life you're meant to protect is your own.